Good afternoon and welcome to the June crop production and WASDE briefing. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. This briefing is for the secretary and or the other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're honored to have Undersecretary Robert Bonney for Farm Production and Conservation as our secretary designate today. We're also honored to have Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's chief economist, with us as well. So welcome to both of you. Mr. Undersecretary, I want to share that we had Mr. Mark Hudson helping us on the citrus portion of the report. He'll be back in a second. Tani Awayewa of our and Kayla Braggs pitching in on the wheat portion of the report. So I also want to make sure and welcome our guests from the House Ag Committee. And from the UK National Farmers Union members. So welcome to everybody. It's great to have you with us. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience today. The crop production and WASDE reports are considered principal federal economic indicator reports. And as such, OMB policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of these reports within 1 hour of their release. We will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS and World Board staff are available for email and phone questions, and NASS will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive, of course, to have everything presented at this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the published estimates. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crop Branch. He will be immediately followed by Dr. Mark Jakanowski, Chair of the World Ag Outlook Board. Lance, it's up to you.
All right, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon and welcome. I appreciate you joining us today. Welcome to all those watching us live stream as well. I've got a fair bit of information to share with you as I usually do, so I'm going to jump right into things, move through here fairly quickly. As usual, I'm going to start things off by talking a little bit about some of the survey work and other information that we utilized in preparing the forecasts in today's report. First, from a winter wheat perspective, we had a couple of survey efforts there. We have what we call our Ag Yield Survey. This is an operator or farmer reported survey. You can see just over 3,000 farmers were sampled this month. Contacted them between May 30th and June the 6th, essentially asking them simply to report what do you expect your yields for winter wheat to be this season. In addition to that, we have our objective yield survey. And as a reminder, instead of surveying farmers, we actually survey wheat fields. And so this month we sampled 975 fields across the 10-state region. Ultimately, we'll get to 1,155 samples, but we only sampled half. In Colorado, Montana, and Washington. We'll bring the rest of those samples on next month. But as you can imagine, the crop a little bit less developed up there, so we kind of phase that process in. And so we incorporate that into the process. And then from a Florida citrus perspective, the only survey effort we have this month is our row count survey. Essentially, that gives us an indication of harvest progress. Harvest is virtually complete at this point. So you can see only 709 rows even observed this month. That was on May 31st. But the big driver on the Florida citrus numbers this late in the season is the utilization data that we get from the Florida Citrus Administrative Committee. And as I mentioned, harvest virtually complete. This data is very close to complete. So really just making some fine tuning there. We'll talk more about that in just a few moments. Very quickly, though, just to give you a quick look at what those sample sizes for ag yield look like across the country. Of course, the deeper the color, the larger the sample size. The largest sample you can see in Kansas, no big surprise there, with winter wheat being the crop of interest this month. Just a quick update on the status of the winter wheat crop this year. A couple of slides here that come from our weekly crop progress and condition report. First up, we have the percent of the crop that's rated in good to excellent condition. You can see the dark red line here is the current season. Probably the big news here, you can see a little bit of an increase over the last few weeks. Obviously still well below most years in the series, but it did creep a bit ahead of last year, due primarily to some recent rains, mostly in Texas, Oklahoma, reaching up into parts of Kansas, really having a positive impact on some of the sentiment there as far as condition ratings go. And then from a progress standpoint, really nothing too exciting here. As you can see, this is heading progress on the chart that you see here, pretty much middle of the road, pretty close to the 5-year average. Harvest just getting underway in general. This past week overall, we were 4% harvested. So it'd probably be a couple more weeks before we can really gauge where we stand relative to prior years. Most of that progress either in the Southeast or in Texas and Oklahoma. Texas 29% harvested, Oklahoma up to 15%. So we should get rolling pretty good here within the next week or two. So with that said, let's go ahead and update you on the winter wheat forecast. No change to planted or harvested acreage from our previous month. That's the typical format that we would follow this time of year. But as a reminder, part of the big story this year is the high abandonment. So as you look at that harvested number, it is up 7.8% from last year, but that's due to the big increase in planted acreage. The story there, again, 67.4% harvested to planted ratio, second lowest ever, lowest since 1917. It's going to be very interesting to see what the acreage survey that we're doing right now tells us, especially in light of some of those recent rains. So stay tuned. We'll see what that reveals on June the 30th. And how that impacts our forecast next month. Yield, we're now forecasting 44.9 bushels per acre. That's up just 0.4% or 0.2 of a bushel from last month's forecast. Of course, it is still down 4.5% or 2.1 bushels from last year's final yield. So that puts our updated forecast at 1.14 billion bushels, up just 0.5% from last month, 3% above last season. Taking a closer look at the yield and how it compares over the last 30 years, you see the trend line plotted in there as well. Just like I mentioned last month, this does represent the lowest yield since 2015. And as you can see on the graphic, the 4th consecutive season of declining yields. This first map with data that I have for you highlights the winter wheat yields by state. The first map here shows the percent change from last month's forecast. I'll show you a change from last year in just a moment. But just as a quick reminder, the top number is the yield forecast. The lower number is the percent change from last month. Any state colored in blue is up. Any state colored in red is down. The deeper the color, the larger the change. And again, with just a very small change nationally, you can see pretty small changes across the country as well. As I mentioned, some of those recent rains in the southern plains giving a little bit of hope there. Conversely, some of those drier areas to the east, you see a little bit of decline in yields there, but generally speaking, pretty minor changes across the country from last month. But as we look at those changes from last year, of course, the color scheme here looks very much like what you would have seen last month. But generally speaking, those drier areas through the plains states taking a pretty significant toll on yields there. And likewise in the soft red to the east, just not as severe a declines as what we see through the plains states and up into Oregon and Washington. Next, we'll give you a closer look at the production, put some perspective around how it compares over time. The 1.14 billion bushels would represent the second lowest production since 1970. You see the slight increase from last year, but again, that's due to the increased acres this season. I do have a couple of slides to share with you with some information from our objective yield survey. First here, you can see the percent of those samples that were processed in the lab, which means they were mature enough to actually harvest and send off to our lab for analysis. As the chart indicates, 9% of those samples in the lab, but if you look back over time, that's pretty normal for this month. Obviously, we'll see the big spike hitting the lab beginning next month. And then some additional data from objective yield. Here you can see a couple of things. First, from the objective yield, that vertical bar represents the number of heads per square foot as measured from the objective yield survey. Those red dots represent our yield forecast for that 10-state region where we do objective yield. And of course, the big story here, you can look at the chart and see that bar is not very tall because we are looking at just 37.9 heads per square feet. I only looked back as far as 2009. I couldn't find anything that low. And so it's low. So that's obviously having a big impact on your yield. If you don't have heads, it's hard to have a very high yield. Breaking it down now by class, here you can see the winter wheat production forecast by class. The hard red winter, you can see even though it's up 2.2% from last month's forecast, it is still down 1% and still expected to be the lowest level since 1957. Soft red down just slightly, but the sharp increase, again, acreage driven, pushing that up. And then the white winter, if you remember back to the yield map, you saw some pretty sharp declines in Washington and Oregon. And so overall 11.4% below last year, second lowest level on that portion of the crop since 2015. So how does this compare with what folks were expecting? As a quick reminder here, the way this graphic is laid out, each of those blue dots represents a industry member's published expectation of the winter wheat production. The red block represents the NASS forecast, and you can see that red block pretty much right in the middle of that cluster of dots. So really should not be a big surprise today. We do have some other crops included in the report today as well. First, I'll talk about hops. Here we've got our first look at acres strung for harvest this season. You can see we're looking at 54,700 acres strung. Idaho, Oregon, and Washington make up the total there. You can see that's down 8.5% from the acreage last season. In fact, second consecutive year of declining acres after many years of increasing acres. So still a relatively high total. We do expect lower acreage in all three states this year. Also included in the June report as usual is our forecast of both sweet and tart cherry production. And so you can see for the sweet cherries this year, we're expecting 371,000 tons to be produced. That's up 60.1%. That's due to a big problem last year, of course. So we did have a freeze event in Washington last year that greatly reduced the production there. That 371,000 tons is actually a pretty typical or normal level for that crop. Washington, of course, is our largest producing state. They're expecting their largest crop since 2018. For the tart cherries, that's 203 million pounds we expect produced this year. That's down 16.9%. Michigan is our largest producing state there. We did include the pie chart here. Don't often do this, but because these crops are measured in different units, just wanted to provide a little perspective around, how they relate to each other. And as you can see, sweet cherries really about 80% of the total cherry production. The graphics on the right will give you a little bit of perspective around how those crops have varied over the recent years. Also, you can talk about maple syrup. This is when we publish our annual maple syrup numbers each year. You can see for this season that just wrapped up here fairly recently, 4.18 million gallons produced. That's down 15.5% from last year. But as you can tell by the chart there, last year was a very high production year. So again, very typical production level that we're looking at this season. Of course, Vermont is our largest producing state. In fact, they make up about 47% of the total taps in the country and about 48.9% of the production. So very dominant for maple syrup in Vermont. And then last but not least, we do have an update for our citrus forecast included in the report as usual for June. Only Florida reporting updates this month. Looking at the all oranges, you can see up just 0.2% from last month's forecast. That's due to $100,000 increase in the Valencia portion of the crop. As I mentioned, both Valencias and non-Valencias virtually complete on harvest, so we wouldn't expect much change happening from here on there. Similar story for the grapefruit, virtually unchanged from last month. Lemons, of course, are carried forward because they're not forecast or estimated in Florida. And then last but not least, the tangerines, very minor adjustment made there, down just 10,000 boxes from last month in Florida. When it comes to tangerines, California is really the dominant player there. So not much change based on the small adjustment in Florida. This next slide just highlights some of the upcoming releases over the next month. I can see cattle on feed coming up on the 23rd, and then the big reports hitting at the end of the month with hogs and pigs on the 29th, and of course on the 30th. I already mentioned the acreage report. A lot of folks anticipating what's happening there, and of course grain stocks, rice stocks, ag prices as well. And then of course in July we'll cycle things over again with the care reports at the beginning of the month and looking forward to the new crop production forecast on July the 12th. The last reminder I'll share is just that at 1 o'clock Eastern time this afternoon, as usual, I'll be on Twitter hosting our regular Stat Chat series, taking any questions that folks might have about any of the numbers that we have included in the report today. So that's the last slide I have. I'm going to pass things over to Mark and let him update you on the WASDE.
All right.
Go. Very good. Get out of your way.
Okay. Thank you, Lance. And as Lance said, let me give you the update on WASDE for this month. Lance talked a little bit about the wheat information he gave us this morning. That's going to be a big focus of our discussion today. But of course, along with wheat, as we do every month, we look at all of our commodities globally and update those balance sheets accordingly. One other topic we're going to talk a little bit about today is palm oil. We don't often give it a big focus in our briefing, but some weather events in Malaysia that warrant some discussion. A little bit of a headline there. So starting out with wheat production globally. Raised this month, pretty big increase, record global production forecast. And mainly what's driving this is good weather really across, most of the European continent. Increases in your good production in European Union, Black Sea region, Russia, Ukraine. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I have some slides to share. Turkey as well. Favorable spring rains, relatively cool temperatures, favorable temperatures, suggesting good production prospects across that entire region. And in India as well, that increase in India this month, that just represents government data, the third advanced estimate from India, showing a larger crop there as well. So let's talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. I'm going to kind of cover both of those countries together since it's kind of a similar story driven by the weather. Just real quick, really the focus here is on winter wheat production, and map here just shows the main winter wheat production regions in Russia, and then similarly in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is mostly winter wheat, so so that almost entirely winter wheat here. Couple things to note here, as you are aware, of course, war going on in Ukraine makes things a little bit difficult in terms of forecasting. The areas that are currently occupied by Russia, we don't have good information on. We assume production there is zero. So our forecast is based on the information we get from Ukraine that kind of covers the area of the country where they have good data, and then of course our weather information as well. So year over year, area in Ukraine is down, but given really good weather that they've had this spring, yields are up. Yields are actually going to be above the 5-year average in Ukraine. A lot more detail on kind of how these estimates came up are presented in the FAS World Agricultural Production Report. So you can refer to that. But so regarding precipitation in Ukraine across this region, kind of back toward April, very heavy rain you can see across Ukraine, good rains throughout most of the Russian winter wheat production areas as well. May, good rains continued in Russia. Ukraine kind of dried out a bit, but given the abundant rainfall they got in April, that moisture carried through. So overall conditions favorable across that entire winter wheat region. Temperature is also relatively cool. So no concerns there about heat, again, across the winter wheat areas at least. And it's showing up as favorable vegetation. This is the VHI Vegetation Health Index across the winter wheat areas, very favorable. I'll just note, it's worth noting that if you go further east into the, I guess it's not going to participate. if you go further east into the spring wheat areas of Russia and Kazakhstan, it's been brutally hot, dry. Conditions there are poor. Still relatively early, so there's time to recover. We didn't make any changes in our spring wheat forecast in that region, but this is something to kind of have on the radar. We'll continue to watch that as that crop matures coming into the upcoming months. So again, all of our changes for this month represented winter wheat and reflect good conditions and higher yields. So Russia, some historic context here in terms of where we stand in terms of Russia wheat production, down a bit from last year's record, but still very good yields. Forecast higher this month. And similarly, Ukraine yields up this month, area down pretty substantially year over year. Again, that clearly just reflects the wartime tensions and inability to get the crop in, but conditions are good otherwise, weather conditions and yields. So production is forecast up 6% from last month, down 17% from last year. So global balance sheet in terms of wheat, we talked about production, supply up pretty substantially this month. Feed use up this month as well. Much of that is in China. As you might be aware, China's been getting some pretty serious rain right as that crop is coming into harvest. That's going to affect the quality. So we anticipate more of that wheat is going to be feed grade, going to be going into feed use. And then also higher feed use in India and Russia. Then in terms of trade, adjusted our trade estimate up this month, nearly 3 million tons. That reflects higher exports out of Ukraine, Russia, EU, and India. Worth noting, India still has export restrictions in place, but this increase reflects shipments mainly for humanitarian food aid purchases, things like that. And then speaking of Ukraine, we did raise our new crop forecast for Ukraine exports by 500,000 tons to now at 10.5 million tons. And old crop exports have also been strong, so we raised that forecast by 1 million tons, and it is now at 16 million tons. U.S. balance sheet, not a lot to talk about here. Lance already talked about the production change for wheat, so we just incorporated that directly. Just again, focusing on this new crop year, no changes in terms of any of the use categories, so that higher production forecast falls directly into ending stocks, raising stocks a bit. Average market price, we lowered 30 cents a bushel. And that is reflecting, well, both current prices and the fact that both U.S. and global supplies are up a bit. Rice production. Main thing to talk about here is really in last year's crop. We got, again, this is data out of India, the third advanced estimate, suggesting that India's rice crop, it was larger than we had been forecasting. So we raised that by 4 million tons, carried some of that forward into just kind of carrying the trend forward into the new crop year as well, to raise that in India's forecast for the new crop year by 1 million tons, slightly offset by lower production forecasts for Cambodia and Thailand, mainly reflecting some concerns going forward about potential effects of El Nino. So global balance sheet for rice. This is really entirely an India story. So again, for the back year production change, that's an increase in the size of India's crop. Most of that falls into ending stocks, which then comes into new balance sheet as beginning stocks, as you can see there. So total supplies for the new crop year increased to, up again, mainly reflecting India. Ending stocks as well, up for the end of the new crop year, and that is mostly in India as well. So again, all of the major changes in the balance sheet this month reflect that higher than previously expected India crop. US balance sheet, focusing on the current crop year, the back year as we call it, exports, we've seen some recent strength in rice exports, mainly long grain, Western Hemisphere destinations. So we raised our export forecast to 1 million hundredweight. That comes right out of ending stocks, which then just follows right into the beginning stocks for the new crop year. It didn't make any changes to any of the other components of the new balance sheet. So that as a result tightens up the ending stocks forecast for the new crop year by 1 million tons, 1 million hundredweight. No changes to the season average market price. So moving into corn, again, focusing a little bit on the back year here. Of course, back year, Southern Hemisphere. So this is the crop that's just being harvested. So we're looking at harvest results here. Argentina's crop adjusted lower, 2 million tons, kind of offset by a increase in Brazil's production forecast by 2 million tons. Again, this is based on government data, harvest results as they're coming in. And then the rest of the countries in terms of the old crop year, those mainly reflect government data, kind of final estimates for those crops. So lower, a little bit smaller crop in Mexico, increase in South Africa, and an increase in India. And then for the new crop year, this is again here change driven primarily by one country, Ukraine, and this is higher area reported directly by Ukraine. So this is Ukraine data, and the balance here, just the one country that's not listed that kind of makes up the difference is Zambia, a little bit higher there as well, higher production. So global balance sheet for corn. When we look at the old crop, 2022, 2023, the main story there, the main kind of driving change this month is higher exports in Brazil and higher exports out of Brazil and Ukraine, when offsetting some lower exports from Argentina and US. Old crop Ukraine exports, we now have forecasted 27 million metric tons. That's up 1 million from last month. In terms of new crop, feed use, we talked about supply already. Feed use up 2.2 million tons. That's mainly in the EU, and that reflects a few things, including some of that increased imports from Ukraine, also going into feed use. And Ukraine is also dominating the increased trade forecast for the new crop year as well, and now forecast at 19 million metric tons for the new crop year. Ending stocks, little change there. So higher ending stocks in the US and Paraguay, offset by lower ending stocks in Mexico and South Africa. US balance sheet, a few changes here. Again, focused really just on the current crop year, the back year side of the balance sheet. Mainly just truing up trade data. So cut back our import forecast by 15 million bushels. That reflects just census trade data. Export forecast reduced 50 million bushels. Fairly slow sales pace recently, and expectation of a drop off in exports in July as Brazil's supplies start to come onto the global market. So the result, slightly higher ending stocks for the old crop year carrying through into beginning stocks for the new crop year. No other changes to the new crop year balance sheet. So that raises new year ending stocks 35 million bushels, and no change to our season average market prices for either of the crop years. Moving into soybeans. Again, back year, old crop year changes. Government data again for Argentina and Brazil. So Argentina, as you know, drought impacted them pretty heavily this year. So their crop cut again, 2 million tons. Again, that's government data, harvest results. And in Brazil, on the other hand, very favorable conditions. Their crop raised 1 million tons, again, based on government data. New crop year, just modest change to production and that's EU soybean production. So small change there. In terms of the global soybean balance sheet, pretty small changes across both years this time around. Old crop year crush lowered 1.1 million tons. That's largely lower crush in Argentina, offset a little bit by higher crush in Brazil. And then trade up a bit for the old crop year. That is mostly, believe it or not, higher exports out of Argentina. Soybean exports out of Argentina, likely reflecting their soy dollar program, supporting those exports. Now for the new crop year, again, we talked about production, small change there. Crush down, that is mainly lower crush in Argentina, reflecting tight supplies. Ending stocks up a bit, that's higher ending stocks in Brazil, US, offset to some degree by lower ending stocks in Argentina. US balance sheet, again, similar to corn, kind of truing up based on recent trade data. Relatively sluggish export pace in May, and we anticipate that going forward as well. So pulled back our soybean export forecast by 15 million bushels. A lot of competition from South America, competing against US supplies there. So higher ending stocks for the old crop year, 15 million bushels, again, carries through into the new crop year. No change to any of the other parts of the balance sheet. So that ends up in ending stocks. No change to our season average prices either. Now we're going to take a small diversion here since we're talking about soybeans and just briefly highlight another oil seed, palm oil. Malaysia, of course, the majority of nearly all palm oil produced in Malaysia and Indonesia. But just worth drawing your attention to the fact that Malaysia has had some very unusual weather over the past year or so. Last year's rain totals were more than 2 standard deviations above average. This is a record high, as far as our records go back, record high rainfall total for Malaysia. Hope I didn't say Indonesia before this. We're talking about Malaysia here. So record precipitation in 2002. This affects the crop that's harvested this year. It's going forward. So that was last year's rainfall. Things kind of dried out a little bit at the end of last year, but then they got hit with another major blast of rain in February. Unprecedented rainfall, 18 inches over about a 3-week period there. So that is also going to impact yields, supplies this year. And as a result of that, we pulled our yield forecast back. Production down about 2% for this year, and just kind of worth, again, a couple reasons to highlight this. As you probably know, Malaysia palm oil has big implications for global food security. It's also worth noting that Malaysia yields have been trending lower for several years now. Trees are getting older, and the last 2 years they've faced some challenges. 2 years ago, they had challenges with getting harvest because of COVID and labor issues. Now this year, they've got wet weather affecting yields. And then as we look just looking forward to have on our radar the potential of an El Nino that could suggest dry conditions next year and, potential yield concerns going forward. We're not there yet, but again, just something to think about going forward as we think generally about the global palm oil market. So, all right, so now let's move into cotton. World cotton production increased this month in world cotton production, driven by the United States. We're going to talk about that obviously in just a minute. Beyond that, reduced our production forecast for China by 500,000 bales. And this same story we talked about last month, basically what's going on there, Xinjiang region, which accounts for the majority of production. Very cold spring, delayed start to the planting season. They have a very short season to begin with. So that is continuing to impact their yield prospects there. Pakistan, on the other hand, that increase this month reflects various press reports and other information that suggests acreage higher than we expected. So we will see. Global cotton supply and demand balance sheet. So beginning stocks up, just focusing on the out year, the new crop year. Beginning stocks up a bit, carrying into the new crop year. That mainly reflects back year consumption still lagging. We did cut last year's consumption again this month, but as you can see, we are anticipating a strong rebound in consumption for this year. Raised it also this month, and that reflects the fact inventories are depleted. So we expect, just some normal replenishment of depleted inventories, and as of now, at least expectations of soft landing for the economy and no major recessionary pressures. In terms of trade, trade forecast raised this month and pretty strong growth year over year. Half of this increase this month in trade is anticipated imports by China, and the US should account for a significant proportion of that. Speaking of the US balance sheet, so the old crop year, so that crop currently being marketed, a couple things going on there. Reduced mill use, that's just based on AMS data. So that's based just again truing up to actual data as it's coming in, relatively slow mill use. And exports, on the other hand, up. We've seen some pretty strong export sales, both export sales data and export data from the census, suggesting strong export demand there. So the result, a little bit tighter ending stocks, down by 300,000 bales for the current crop year. Tightens up beginning stocks into the new crop year, but the main story, the big story for the new crop year is a large anticipated increase in harvested area in West Texas, much smaller abandonment because of recent strong favorable rainfall there. So that increases US supplies up 700,000 bales after you account for the lower beginning stocks, and that falls into expectations that export growth, export strength will continue, and then a little bit of an increase in ending stocks as well. We did reduce our season average market price by $0.01, and that reflects current prices and just the fact that US supplies are up as well. Just real quick, this is basically the data that's behind our, likely lower cotton abandonment in West Texas. Very favorable rainfalls in April, well above average, supporting lower abandonment. So moving into sugar, I'm going to mix things up a little bit here. Normally I talk about the domestic sugar balance sheet first, but in this case, most of the changes in domestic balance sheet reflect happenings in Mexico. So I'm going to first talk about Mexico balance sheet. In the old crop year, we reduced production 155,000 metric tons. The harvest there is wrapping up. There's still a few mills operating, but that crop is smaller than originally anticipated. So then we have to figure out, so where are those lower supplies? How are those lower supplies going to be allocated? We assume that half of those smaller supplies are going to be lower shipments to IMEX, and the other roughly half are going to be exports and some changed ending stocks as well. And that lower export volume, that entirely reflects lower exports to the US. So that's why, again, I'm talking about Mexico before talking about the US. And then as we look forward into the new crop year for Mexico, again, exports up a bit, production rebound, and exports up again, up a bit. Again, that would all be going to the US, and a little bit tighter ending stocks for Mexico. So implications for the US. Old crop year, US supply and demand, couple things going on here. Production up a bit. This is, again, we're just basically using reporting processor data there, but imports down. Overall, high tier sugar imports up, just for reflecting a continued strong pace of refined sugar imports, but lower imports from Mexico. The reason, of course, why the numbers don't match up, where we changed units here. Now we're talking about 1,000 short tons. The previous slide was in metric units. But lower imports, tightening up US supplies, tightening up ending stocks. We're going to carry fewer ending stocks into the current crop year. We also adjusted production a little bit lower for cane and beets, basically based on some processor projections there. And Mexico imports up, again, reflecting that data that I showed you on the previous balance sheet, but Mexico will export to the US all that they can, but notice that we still have a pretty tight stocks to use ratio. So ending stocks down this month and year over year for sugar. All right, let's move into meat and livestock. Starting out with beef production, raised our beef production forecast for the current year. Now we're shifting to calendar years here, of course. So 2023 calendar year beef production up, mainly reflecting a combination of higher weights, higher marketings, and a little bit higher cow slaughter. And then for 2024, beef production up just a little bit there as well. And that mainly reflects the higher placements in the second quarter of this year, being slaughtered next year. Pork production, no changes in either year, or rounds basically to zero in 2023. As Lance noted, we'll get a new hogs and pigs report at the end of this month. So we'll wait until then to make any, see what kind of changes that might warrant, and didn't make any changes on the out year. For any of the other species, 2023 changes for broiler, that just broiler production down a bit. That just reflects second quarter current pace of slaughter. Turkey production down a bit, just reflecting some hatchery data there. Prices, steer prices jump out at you. Strong demand, and especially then as you go into 2024, strong demand and tighter supplies. So these are record prices now and going forward, and again driven by strong demand. So and current observed prices. Hogs, on the other hand, didn't make any small increase, 25 cents per hundredweight increase for 2023. No change to our 2024 price forecast. And broilers and turkey, adjustments in the current calendar year, just reflecting current prices and expectations going forward. Meat trade, Really not a lot going on here either. Just seeing some strength in pork export data, but not a single story to point to. We're just really seeing increased shipments and demand from a number of markets. So that's for 2023, and we expect it to continue into next year. And really nothing to speak of in terms of the other species. So then with regard to dairy, dairy milk supply and demand, actually for 2023, so rounds to zero, but just noting that we anticipate a little bit slower growth in milk per cow for 2023 and into 2024. So small changes there. In terms of our imports and exports, fat basis imports, that upward adjustment is mainly reflecting butter, increased butter imports, lower fat base exports, mainly reflecting slower exports of cheese and whey. Skim solids, small changes there, imports, just various odds and ends, many different products, not much jumps out at you there. And then in terms of the export forecast on a skim solids basis, mainly lower exports of non-fat dry milk and whey. And as you can see for calendar year 2024, hardly any changes, rounds to zero. So in terms of dairy prices, pulled back our cheese price forecast. We're starting to see some weakening of demand, both domestically and in terms of exports, pushing prices a little bit lower there. In the current calendar year, expected also to carry into next calendar year as well. Butter price forecast up just a penny based on current data. Non-fat dry milk, looking ahead to 2024, just increased the price there a little bit based on strong international demand. Dry whey for 2023, that's mainly strong international competition, pushing prices lower. And then so when we take all this into account in terms of the class prices, class 3 price for 2023 lowered by $1 per hundredweight, mainly reflecting those lower cheese and whey prices. Class 4 up a bit based on higher butter prices. That's all for 2023. And then as we look ahead into 2024, class 4 price up a bit based on higher prices for non-fat dry milk. And then all milk price forecast reduced for both calendar years, 2023 down by 55 cents per hundredweight, and 2024 down by 25 cents per hundredweight. And that is all I have in terms of the top line information from this month's WASDE. Thank you for attending. Thank all your guests for joining us today. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed it. And everyone online, thank you also for joining, and we will see you back here next month. And with that, turn it over for questions.